Good afternoon. I'm delighted to announce our next session, Nuclear Coordination, Policy, Strategy, and the Future Grid. If time allows, at the end of the session, the panel will take questions submitted by the audience. You can scan the QR codes that you'll see on the screens around the room. Please do be sure to silence your cell phones if you haven't already done so. Enjoy the conversation, and please join me in giving a warm welcome to our moderator, Casey Herman, a retired energy sector leader from PricewaterhouseCoopers.
Thank you, and thanks everybody for hanging in there on a Friday afternoon. I think it's going to be worth your time because this is just absolutely one of the hot topics that I'm hearing about at all of the energy events that I go to around the country. So development of nuclear has, well, we've been talking about a nuclear renaissance for quite a while. There's not quite a lot of plants under construction yet, but I think it's coming soon, and I think this is such a important and relevant topic for us, and we've got a great panel here to discuss it. So to my left is Stephen Swiber, who is the Chief Resilience Officer for the Office of the Louisiana Governor. To his left is Luke Bolar, the Chief External Affairs Officer for ClearPath. And I'll just ask each of you all to give yourselves a little bit of an introduction. What do you do? Talk a bit about your organizations and any opening comments you'd like to make, and then we'll get into our discussion.
Fantastic. Thanks, Casey. As you said, my name's Stephen Swiber. Up until this week, I was the Chief Resilience Officer in the Office of Governor Jeff Landry. Now I'm the Deputy Secretary of Energy and Natural Resources for the state of Louisiana. Very thankful to be here at my old alma mater. Political economy class of 15, Masters of Management Energy class of 16 for anybody who might be in that program. It's an excellent one. I see you over here. Fantastic. And I was happy to be here last year where we were able to talk about, well, we had a panel on electricity, the future of the regulation and of the load growth. And the problem was that at least two of the panelists knew about the Meta data center, but couldn't talk about it yet. So now I'm happy to be here in a time when we can actually be out in the open about our need to get some power, get some juice on the grid. And so I look forward to talking about that with you all today. Luke?
Sure, thanks. And thanks, Casey, and thanks, Tulane. So I'm Luke Bolar, Chief External Affairs Officer at ClearPath. We're an energy policy advocacy organization based in Washington, D.C. Our mission is to accelerate American innovation to reduce global energy emissions. So we focus a lot of time on what are the policies needed to help scale new startup energy technologies and help get them to commercialization. And so that's everything from R&D to demonstrations to federal tax incentives and in some cases financing. And then obviously there's a regulatory thread that comes through all of that too. So just given our mission statement, you can probably imagine that nuclear is a huge part of the work we do. We've spent most of our time working in the advanced reactor sector with policies to help scale them. Also love the existing fleet and all things clean energy. So we also spend time working on carbon capture, geothermal, hydropower, long duration energy storage, natural gas, all things low emission and American made.
So just to provide some context, nuclear energy in the U.S., there are a little bit over 90 active plants in the U.S. That number is going up because two plants that had been retired are being restarted. The Chris Crane Nuclear Center, which is 3 Mile Island, but they have renamed it after the former CEO of Exelon Constellation Energy, Chris Crane. That is due to restart in 2027. They've actually accelerated the restart date by 6 months. So that process is going very smoothly. And then the Duane Arnold plant, owned by NextEra, is in the process of being restarted. So I had always been told as an energy consultant and expert that once you shut them down, you can never reopen them. Turns out that's not really accurate. There are uprate projects all over the country. Almost every nuclear plant is addressing an uprate. So if you have a 1,000 megawatt plant, perhaps you can get 1,020 or 1,040 megawatts out of it by improving some of the instrumentation and getting slightly bigger steam generators. So right now, there's a lot of money going into reinvesting in existing nuclear, but I think there's a lot of discussion about the need for new nuclear. So 90 plants in the U.S., 2 of those are in Louisiana already, Waterford and Riverbend. In the U.S., 8% of the energy capacity is nuclear plants, but that's nameplate capacity. They run all the time. So almost 20% of the energy generated in the U.S. comes from nuclear power. So 8% of the nameplate capacity, more than twice of that, is the energy generation. So it's a very efficient asset once it's up and running. And just one last statistic, 42% of the carbon-free energy in the U.S. comes from nuclear plants. So with all of the growth in renewable, again, because these nuclear plants are big, 1,000 megawatts and more, and they run all the time, a tremendous amount of carbon-free energy comes from them. And all of that is relevant to the state of Louisiana. As you mentioned, there's the Meta data center, but there are new LNG terminals coming in. There's industries that are opening up, new refining, and you would know this far more than me, Stephen, but the economic growth in the state is significant, and it's very energy intensive. So ultimately, the state's going to need more capacity and more energy. And nuclear is a very viable solution for that. So that's sort of the backdrop of our conversation. And let me just open up with a question for you all, and Stephen, this is probably more for you, but why does nuclear make sense in Louisiana? Why is it a good solution for the energy system of the state?
Is that one for me? Okay.
Yes.
Yeah. No. Well, first of all, nuclear, it's already proven out a good bit in Louisiana, right? When you said it's 9% of the nameplate capacity nationwide, we're running at about 20% right here in Louisiana. So that's as you said, through Waterford, through Riverbend. Waterford already has an early site permit, for an additional reactor. Riverbend, the company did about 40 to 50% of the work for an early site permit back once upon a time before gas prices really went down. So that, first of all, is one reason that they're already a few years ahead of the game if they do want to get started. Entergy's been an excellent utility for attacking that problem. They are doing those upgrades like other utilities are doing to get more capacity out of the existing plants. And so we already have a good basis for the workforce, right? The AP1000 is it's a large modular reactor, but it is a modular construction. In fact, the Vogtle plants that were erected in Georgia were built partially in modular places in Lake Charles. So in 16 coastal ports all around Louisiana, we have the logistical capability, we have the welders, the instrumentation folks. Look, a nuclear plant, a Vogtle was $30 billion, right? We're hoping that future ones will not be quite so expensive. But when you're talking about a state that can build a $5 billion to $10 billion to maybe even $20 billion plant, I don't think anybody has as many of those locations as the state of Louisiana. You really have to build a $5 billion plant to even be remarkable in the river corridors. So we're excited for all of our $100 million and $1 billion, $2 billion economic development wins, like the $5 billion Hyundai steel plant that's coming. But when it comes to that supply chain, no one is used to building big, modular, and better than the state of Louisiana.
Yeah, and again, just as a little context, Vogtle 3 and 4 went live for Southern Company in Georgia. Unfortunately, they were built in the middle of COVID, which added to a lot of those cost overruns. But Vogtle 4 came in, and I forget the exact number, but I think 20% cheaper than Vogtle 3.
Yeah, they're not. I think he wasn't supposed to say anything, but Jigger Shaw said 30% at an event just like this. So maybe we'll trust him. Yeah,
that's the numbers I hear around that level. And then you alluded to AP1000s, which are big plants, but there's also a lot of discussion about small modular reactors. So those technologies are certainly on the horizon, and there's a whole host of companies that are hoping to build those plants, and they're being built in other parts of the world. And actually, there's one that will be built, several that will be built in the U.S. A big hurdle that has to be cleared to build one of these new assets is siting and permitting. And, it takes a lot to get a site license through the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. Luke, maybe you can talk about some of the federal activities going on to make that process, which should be arduous to keep these plants safe, but perhaps expedite it a bit.
Sure. And I'll maybe add why Louisiana. It's like, why not anywhere? Because nuclear is not geographically constrained like certain renewable technologies. Hydropower is an example, wind, solar. You don't need to be right next to a pipeline. There's a lot of advantages just for geography and geologic, geothermal, for example. So Louisiana's great. Everywhere's great in our opinion. Siting and licensing and the regulations gets tricky. Just last year, Congress took a really big action. There was a federal policy called the Advance Act. I don't even know what every word in the acronym is, but it was essentially a way to streamline federal licensing. And so the way that the Nuclear Regulatory Commission was looking at nuclear reactors was the way they always have, which is the old, larger AP1000s. So when you're building something smaller, presumably you could look at them and license them and figure out the regulations for them in a different way. They're smaller, they're cheaper, they're newer. So that was a big piece of legislation that went through, and notably 88 US senators and 350 some members of Congress, meaning it was very, very bipartisan, which is also a really exciting new trend for the industry. Historically, and in some of the states that Casey mentioned where reactors were looking to shut down, there was political and public opposition. That's kind of starting to go away in a good way. And so you have, in 3 Mile Island's case, and another one to mention is Palisades in Michigan, is another restart. Palo Verde out in California, those were areas where there was public and political pressure to shut those down or just not relicense them, and that's changing. Now you have both parties really excited about the future of nuclear, and so now that we can take the next step and think about how we regulate, license, permit them for the size that they are and the new innovations that they are, I think that's a really good thing. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission, we're about a year out from that law. They say they're on pace to sort of meet all the deadlines for how they can start implementing the new ways of doing this. And so when you start to piece together all the different elements of what it takes to scale up new nuclear, we're really confident and optimistic that we're starting to get there.
And part of the licensing discussion, it takes a long time to prepare a license, the application, right? It takes years to prepare. So, one of the reasons people rationalize building new nuclear is because of the advent of AI and the energy intensity of data centers. But AI is also being used to expedite that application process. And there are companies out there, Atomic Island and others, that have come up with some pretty cool products to help the nuclear energy industry be a little bit more efficient. So the technology, I think, is well developed to build new nuclear. AP1000s are pretty well developed. The SMRs, they're building one, I think, in Poland or Hungary or Czechoslovakia. They're building them internationally, and the Chinese are building both big units and small units, I think. And the licensing can be overcome. What I hear, and there is, I think, demand, and we'll talk more about this for nuclear, but the hyperscalers like the idea of nuclear because of its reliability and because of its carbon-free nature. The issue is financing and finding equity to build these plants. I guess I'd ask both of you, what are your thoughts about accessibility to equity? Certainly there's government loan guarantees that are helpful, but that doesn't help on the equity side. What are you all seeing? Maybe it helps, but it doesn't replace equity. What are you all seeing in terms of the access to equity to build these plants?
Couple of things. So the Loan Program Office and the DOE does have some programs that do help. Congress just passed the big reconciliation package, included tax incentives for it's called tech neutral tax incentives, and nuclear qualifies for that. And so there is eligibility for production tax credits and investment tax credits through that. And those credits now go through the early 2030s, which should be beneficial to some of these projects. There is also federal policy that can help on this front. I don't know if it addresses equity exactly, but one of the big challenges is just the risk of taking on these investments. And so can we create federal policy that would essentially put in a federal backstop or cost overrun insurance? You could call it either way. I would just call it an nuclear energy dominance fund, maybe would be a better nomenclature. But so there are people in Congress and federal lawmakers that are looking into this, because that does remain probably the largest challenge, especially with the high cost of capital that we're experiencing. I don't know for how long. PwC may have some analysis on that, but probably for several more years. So I do think from a federal policy standpoint, there are ways to help improve some of those cost challenges, and I think we'll see some of those be coming to the introduction and hopefully move forward through Congress even this year or next.
Yeah, I'll chime in on that. And like you said, the demand is there it's gotten the attention of the hyperscalers for the exact reason that you said. It's baseload demand and baseload supply, right? They would love to be powered. I mean, we've seen Meta, Google, Amazon, and others. They would love to have all renewable sources, but those sources are in a minute. And I think if you were going to power Richland Parish's data center entirely with solar, I think you'd probably create a solar farm roughly the size of Delaware. Roughly speaking, it would be about that kind of scale. So they're looking for clean power. They're looking for that kind of base load. And there's a bit of a staring contest going on right now between the hyperscalers and your utilities. Utilities have a monopoly in many states. It's been a regulatory structure that's actually worked for a long time, and maybe part of the reason that Louisiana has some of the cheapest power in the nation, especially on the industrial side, is because we do have a long-standing good relationship between consumers and the utilities. That said, even a large monopoly utility, and you think you build a company and you give them all of the power customers in the state, so everyone's power bill goes up to the same 2 or 3 companies, they still don't have the balance sheets to just take on a risk of that size for that much of their production curve. So they're staring at the tech companies and saying, look, your balance sheet is $4 or $5 trillion. That is of the scale where you could take a $10, $20 billion risk. And the tech companies are rightly looking them back and saying, look, that's not how we got to be $4 trillion companies. We're not the power company. You're the power company. So I think it's definitely, that's the kind of standoff that the federal government could come in and provide with some of those. I mean, we do have nothing's going to happen right now without the assistance of the Loan Programs Office. And Secretary Wright and his team and Donald Trump's team and Secretary Burgum's team, I mean, they say publicly that they're very, very bullish and on nuclear power. And I think when they get into the office in the morning, they're even more so. I mean, they're all in on this, and they want to help solve those problems. So hopefully over the next few years, we have the opportunities to see if we can. We're closer than it looks from the outside, but there's still a lot of problem solving to do.
Yeah, and discussions I've had with the hyperscalers, they have plenty of chips they have to buy for a lot of money, and they get a higher return on a shorter life cycle for those chips, and they know they have to replace them every 3 to 5 years. A 30-year nuclear plant, the economics don't make sense, but they're willing to pay more for power. They're willing to give a above-market PPA to buy nuclear power, but they don't want to take the construction and capital risk, I think.
Exactly, and the hyperscalers are one, the SMRs are going to be great. This is also another, you asked why Louisiana earlier, and I didn't list all of them, right? We have over 50% of Louisiana's load is in the the industrial corridor, right? It's where people need heat also in islanded applications. So they're going to be excellent test cases for the SMRs, and also our reliance on gas is great. We have the cheapest gas in the country. We're proud of it. We drill, baby drill to get there. But a nuclear part of our grid will be a nice hedge against the future of gas price volatility.
Yeah, and potentially LNG growth is a good use of that natural gas rather than powering electricity here in the state if there are other viable options, if the cost works out.
It's freedom fuel. We're enabling democracy through the world. We're freeing people from despotic gas suppliers by shipping it out from right there in Lake Charles, and we couldn't be happier.
Yeah. I don't know if you guys can comment on this, but I know Tennessee Valley Authority has entered into some agreements to build some SMRs, and I think that makes sense because that is a federal backstop. TVA is a corporation, but it's owned by the federal government. Is that a model you think we'll see more of?
Yes. The other advantage TVA has is the Oak Ridge National Lab is right in their backyard. They're one of the 17 national labs, one of the 5 that really does a lot of nuclear R&D. What that means is they're able to actually test technology and help build demonstrations and test reactors. And so when you can create these partnerships with somebody like a TVA, with Oak Ridge National Lab, and then I think the company that's building there is Kairos, which is a molten salt reactor, which is a whole nother cool technology. Then you start to get, a lot of buy-in, both from the local communities, and you can start to piece together the right financing and business models as well.
So, Stephen, I'm curious, as I've talked to some of the SMR companies, they talk about the non-electricity benefits of their products. And you talked about, the Riverbend area where there's so many refineries that need heat, they need steam. Are companies talking about SMRs as an opportunity to maybe replace other sources of those important components of their work?
Absolutely, and we're going to be happy to be partnering with LSU here, I think, in the near future, and other universities in the South, like Texas A&M, to get some licensed components for heat transfer, right? You need I wish we almost had an engineer up here because I don't know what a molten salt reactor is, and I don't know. Apparently the heat transfer involves a lot of tubes, in some sort of loop. I don't know. But all I know is that it takes the nuclear reaction and turns it into heat rather than electricity. And we don't really have those components licensed yet. That's one of the little things we could do here at the state government and in academia is to get those things licensed so that we could try to get those heat applications, because they also have, if you think about the multinational companies in the industrial corridor, that's Shell, that's Dow. Dow, who's building an X-Energy SMR to deploy in their Baytown? Which one is it? Whatever. Baytown, thank you. South of Houston. I wish they would have done it in Louisiana first, but that's okay. They're friends of ours. These are multinational corporations who are making products for a global market, and that global market's demanding a cleaner product. So they're going to be interested in paying that premium for that technology, and that's where the capital comes to be the first deployers, or maybe not the first mover. Everybody in nuclear space wants to be third. They want to be ahead of their competition, but they don't want to be the first. But they're going to be early movers of this technology because there's a competitive advantage for them if they can go out there and they can sell a clean product across the globe.
And I'll add, I think it was last week or the week before, it was called the Industrial Nuclear Energy Consortium. It was Exxon, Conoco, Chevron, Shell, Nucor, Rio Tinto, and maybe one other big industrial player that are going to try to create standards and business models for the heavy industrials to use nuclear for heat. So if you start to think about, okay, we need it for electricity to meet demand for the hyperscalers. Now the heavy industrials and the oil and gas majors are excited about it. Now you can start to envision an order book being built out, which is, to what we discussed earlier, Vogtle 4 was less than Vogtle 3. Mm-hmm. First of a kind is always the most expensive. As we start to build out that order book and start building more, then you can start to bend that cost curve, and then we've theoretically got a real viable industry again.
Yeah, and I think one of the necessities to bend that cost curve, which is critical, is to get some consistency to design. And I think the AP1000s are pretty consistent. There's 8 different SMR designs out there.
DOE just, I think, moved forward with 11 different designers.
Yeah, so part of the challenge of that is getting a supply chain that can consistently make enough at scale to build those reactors. And I guess I'd ask both of you, I mean, you have a supply chain for the reactor components and the vessels and the parts, but also the nuclear fuel. I'd ask, both of you, I mean, what do you think about the opportunities to really refine that supply chain so we can bend the cost curve?
Fuel, I'll start with fuel because that's a huge issue. The U.S. has been fairly reliant on Russia for uranium and enriched uranium and nuclear fuel for decades. Really, since we stopped building reactors, we also stopped building fuel. The next-gen reactors, the SMRs, these micro-reactors, they run on a slightly higher enriched uranium for their fuel. We don't have anywhere that can make that today, but we're changing that. And so to Stephen's point about this administration really getting excited about nuclear, they've put a lot of emphasis on the fuel side and reshoring the fuel supply chain. And so there are 2 new facilities that have broken ground for fuel manufacturing. And so we can start to onshore some of that, which will help with some of the supply chain. That also goes into the design. The challenge of being so many different designs is they all run on slightly different fuel, and so it does add a layer of complexity, but I don't know at the end of the day in a decade from now that every single one of these designs is going to succeed. It'd be great if they did, but it might actually be like 1 or 2 or 3 of them that get to that commercial viability, and then you start to see the supply chain being able to streamline a little and the fuel manufacturing be able to streamline a little, but I don't know. We're excited about all the different innovations and the different designs, and we don't have a favorite, but I do think they'll consolidate eventually.
Yeah, no, I think that order book is going to be very important for standing up that supply chain. I mean, now we're getting into several years now from when people were on the ground building Vogtle 3 and 4. Those workers, they could go find other employment. They could lose their licenses to work on these nuclear components. They can lose their QA, QC, muscle memory. You really need to be making them in succession. That workforce is going to be a really big part. You can't just let them build. You can't build one in a generation or one in a decade and expect that people are going to be there and they're going to keep their licenses. They're going to go into that field. That people are going to major in nuclear engineering year after year if you don't have that going. Now, the Department of Defense will probably be an early mover in adoption, and so their selection of a supplier might be really critical. But I think like I said, in Louisiana, we'll have the probably most available and experienced workforce and the facilities to logistically get those products to market. Now that said, we don't have anything on the fuel side at this time. There's going to be a lot of innovation to do. We still have to figure out the waste problem. I mean, the Department of Energy is responsible for all the waste right now. It's being stored in concrete casts on site. Whether that's reusing old light water reactor waste in SMR products, or whether that's sequestering that waste somewhere in a stratigraphic well. These are all things that are going to have to be innovated at some point over the next few decades if this is ever really going to take off.
So one last question before we open it up to the audience for questions. Nuclear has had a very diverse history in terms of public acceptance. And I remember when I was, a young man in high school, the No Nuke concert. You had James Taylor and Jackson Browne and Bruce Springsteen singing to end nuclear power in the U.S. And now, really, a lot of the environmental groups have turned and become very pro-nuclear because of the carbon-free aspects of it. And it's been the safest source of power in the world. If you look at the production of nuclear power and the injuries that have been caused, by it, it's been, those plants, especially in the U.S., have been extremely well run. What do you see in terms of public acceptance? Do you think that tide continues to be pro-nuclear generally, or?
First, a question for the audience. Does anyone know where Cardi B is on nuclear? Could someone ask her on Twitter or something? X. Ugh. All right,
I don't know where she is, but I will tell you, Katy Perry, Paris Hilton, there's at least one other sort of celebrity who is advocated for nuclear and said, particularly in California, when they wanted to shut down the Palo Verde plant, they were out there saying, we got to keep it open, this is good.
Paris Hilton, by the way, she had a show with Nicole Richie in the 90s. It was a whole thing, but they should know Katy Perry.
Yeah.
T. Swifty, we need T. Swifty.
There's also this interesting new book called Rad Future. This woman who is I think she was a Brazilian model. She's a social media influencer, loves nuclear and tweets about it all the time. Her Twitter is Isodope, I think. I don't know. So there are some like pop culture, small amounts of pop culture helping change the narrative, which is great. Chernobyl, Fukushima, 3 Mile Island, The Simpsons for decades sort of contributed to that negative stereotype. But we've seen it, we poll this, and public perception is great. 10 years ago, you asked general population, do you trust certain types of energy? And coal and nuclear were always very near the bottom. Nuclear is now near the top. And so I think it's especially true with younger generations, maybe who didn't live through the Chernobyl and the hysteria around some of that. But just general population, public opinion trends have improved. And I think that's why this renaissance will actually take on, because 10 years ago, when there was not that public license, we would not have been able to get the 90 votes in the US Senate for a bill to streamline licensing. So it's certainly improving. There are still challenges. One, waste is still something that people will say they're nervous about or scared about. The industry likes to call it spent fuel for that reason, not waste. So
and
that
it
is
can
an
be
issue.
recycled, so it may not be waste, right?
And so these innovations, these new technologies, some of these companies are looking at how to recycle, and so
and France does it. Europe
France already
does,
does,
right?
yeah.
It's not like it's new technology.
There's only one France, as they like to say in nuclear. And if you're too enmeshed in the industry, you'll find that funny, because they really have they've proven a long track record of success. But speaking of the success, and I'm going to get my bonus check from LED today for how many times I can hype Louisiana. But when I talk to DOE, they know that Louisiana is a place where there's a high comfort level with innovation and technology, and especially a high comfort level with nuclear. We've had the 2 plants operating, and I think the public so far, and we haven't talked about building a new reactor in my lifetime, but it's something that I think everyone's pretty bullish about, and something that will attract that technology to us over some of those other states.
Yeah, and I just can't help but believe that siting something at an existing nuclear site makes sense. The transmission is there, the demand is very near those sites, so it makes a lot of sense, but there's a lot of cards that have to fall into the right place to make it happen. We've got about 10 minutes left. I'll ask, the QR codes are on the screen if you want to put a question in for our panelists, and I'll just ask, are there any questions that have come in so far?
Do you see nuclear as an energy of the future or as a bridge to future innovations like hydrogen?
I'm going energy of the future. Hydrogen is going to make a lot of sense in the applications where it makes sense itself, but if you can go straight from that reaction into the heat that you need to drive your industrial process, I think rather than using it to synthesize hydrogen, I mean, that would be for those applications. That's kind of an extra step that you don't necessarily need, as far as to me. Now that said, it's going to make a lot of sense in place. Like the Navy does power ships with nuclear, but it's not going to make sense for most like remote applications or mobile applications. But for the ones that it does, I don't think hydrogen would be necessarily something that would displace it.
I think nuclear may power hydrogen manufacturing. In fact.
Exactly. I mean, you're going to have to make it with energy somehow.
I totally agree. I think hydrogen for electricity is really tricky. Some of the reasons Stephen just mentioned, nuclear is proven, it works, so I would say definitely nuclear. Not that we don't love hydrogen, we do, but nuclear for power.
And I mean, I honestly believe it's got to be an all of the above strategy. Nuclear is going to play a key part, but so might geothermal, right? So might other renewables. They all have a place in our stack of generation mixes, but I think not building more nuclear leaves a hole in that stack. So I would vote with you. It's a power of the future. Do we have other questions that have come in?
From the financing perspective, which do you think will break first? Large-scale nuclear or small-scale modular?
Maybe the hyperscalers are the ones that ultimately make the difference and go to the grid scale first. I mean, when you look at the demand that they're talking about for AI and data centers, it's gigawatts at a time, not hundreds of megawatts at a time. That we've seen if you do get those economies of scale to where you're actually making these in a manufacturing level, kind of managed Six Sigma environment, then we'll start to make big plants out of stacking SMRs. And I think that's currently the plan in Washington. One of the utilities has said, well, we'd rather just stack 10 SMRs so we can just build it over time rather than scale up to one 1,000 megawatt project immediately. But maybe I'm just looking at the balance sheets of the hyperscalers, and if we figure out the financeability problem, they might go to large light water first. What do you think?
Yeah, I kind of want to say that we could continue to build out, Vogtle 5, 6, 7, 8, or not necessarily right there, but a bunch of more AP1000s and get those costs down. I don't know that anybody's planning that, and so I just don't know that it's actually realistic, whereas there are a lot of MOUs being signed with the hyperscalers and some of these next-gen nuclear reactor companies. And so I think there will be, there's probably half a dozen to a dozen that could actually make it through the process and be putting power on the grid in the next 5 to 10 years. So I would probably say the SMRs and smaller next-gen, Gen 4 reactors.
That's fair. They have the venture capital investors on their side. Those guys proved with Uber and some other companies that they can have a high pain tolerance in the pursuit of the ultimate market share goal. Maybe that was in a lower interest era.
Yeah, I'm gonna split the baby, and I think it's gonna be both. I think there are areas of our country that need AP1000s, particularly the Virginia area with the growth that's going on there, maybe Texas with the growth that's going on there, really Louisiana. But there are other applications where SMRs are gonna be a better fit. The problem is we can't have 11 of them. We've got to have 1 or 2 designs so we can get a supply chain that bends the cost curve. And nobody wants to pick the winners or losers on that. So I think it's going to be both. And the AP1000s are proven, right? I mean, we haven't proven we can build them economically. We've proven we can build them effectively.
And I do want to talk about the regulatory there for a second too, because they are building AP1000s in India and in Ukraine for between a seventh and a third of what they could build them for in the United States. I've talked to the nuclear industry, and they say, please don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Let's not throw nuclear regulation to the states. Let's not throw it to the courts. Basically, don't throw out our regulatory structure if you don't have something better with which to replace it. Definitely agree with that. But I would also say that, if you look at our costs versus other countries' costs, and the fact that we've only built 2 reactors since the founding of the NRC in the 70s, we're doing something incorrectly, and it's really prime for reform.
And you mentioned Chernobyl and Fukushima. Those were not design issues or construction issues. Those were operator issues. And we have the best operators in the world in the United States. In fact, we train everybody else's operators. So
operators and updated processes for building, they call it fail-safe. So basically, the core would never melt because it would shut itself off, the way they design them now versus when they started building these in the 70s and 80s. So the technology is just, it's far superior than it was 70 years ago, as it should be. So it would be great. It would be great to build them. I'm not familiar with anybody. There was a started project in South Carolina that's now a giant hole in the ground, and whether that would be the next one to move.
In a bankrupt
it was
company,
a bankruptcy. So I would love to see more AP1000s. I'm not familiar with any in the process.
Yeah. Do we have another question from the audience?
We have 2 questions about hurricane and flooding risks in Louisiana. First, does this hinder nuclear investment? And second, does it influence public acceptance of nuclear in Louisiana? And how might modern reactor designs address those concerns?
Well, I think when the NRC permits a site, they're looking at flood risk at a pretty high level. That said, flood risk is also pretty darn mitigatable. We have a Venture Global just built such a humongous LNG facility down there in Plaquemines Parish, and they just built just an absolutely massive flood wall around the entire thing. I mean, it kind of rises up out like Atlantis. I guess Atlantis sunk. Anyway, so it's everything that comes when you permit a reactor is a risk, but also most of them, except for maybe proximity to a city, are mitigatable in some way when it comes to the design, and that's just that's why that process takes so long, right?
Do we have another question?
Is the regulation keeping up with the ramping up regarding spent energy waste?
No. But I'll turn it over to our experts to comment.
There's more to do on the spent fuel. Ideally, we get some of these innovations for how to recycle in a place where we can scale those into something commercially viable so that we can put a dent in some of it. I don't know who asked the question, if you're familiar. There's this long-standing political joke that Yucca Mountain, which was the site that the federal government designated for spent fuel, I think in the 80s or the 90s, and there's nothing there because all of the locals pushed back, and so all the utilities and the companies just started stacking these casks on there. There's nowhere to put it, and so recycling can help, but it's still a huge challenge for the industry that we need to address.
And the casks are not necessarily bad. I mean, you can fly a jet into these casks, and it's not going to penetrate the cement. And,
yeah.
And to move it to Yucca Mountain or even a recycling facility, you have to move it, and you got to put it on a train, and so there's some risks to moving it as opposed to leaving it on site where there is great security and so you can argue both sides of this one.
Yeah, if you've ever been on site at a nuclear reactor plant, they'll tell you and you have a little radiation monitor. You can walk right up next to these casks and it won't even beep. Like there's hardly any tiny traces of radiation in those spent fuel casks. So they're not particularly dangerous. They wouldn't blow up. They're not enriched anywhere near enough to be a weapon. And given the time they've been there, there's very little radiation. So they're not particularly dangerous. It was a public perception issue for a long time, and now they're just kind of stuck on parking lots and massive fields.
With massive amounts of security around them, which is not a bad thing.
Yeah, they're not a public risk. I would lick them, but they're not doing too much harm.
But they're in remote areas, and so there are worse things I think that we have to deal with. So with that, the red light's flashing here. I think we're out of time. Please give a hand to Stephen and Luke, and a great job we've had.
Thank you for joining us. Our next session will be